Good morning, sunshines. Hope you're all doing well. Beautiful sunny day, at least here today. First of all, we're going to talk about Tartuffe a little bit. For those of you who had Tartuffe assigned to you as your play to present, again, please send that information to me, your analysis of it, and I will pass it along to the rest of the class. I have included in your notes a link to the entire performance of the play. Again, the play is written in a rhymed couplet. This type of verse is called Alexandrine verse, as opposed to the iambic pentameter of Shakespeare. It's 12 beats to the line, as opposed to 5 beats to the line. So it's more, it's a quicker rhythm. And again, it has rhymed couplets at the end. And in this case, the rhyme is there. The meter and the rhyme are both there. So one of the things about the translation we're using is, of course, the play was originally written in French. And so not only has the translator been able to maintain the meter of the Alexandrine verse, but they've also been able to maintain, in, I would say, almost all instances, the rhyme, which is an amazing feat for translation from French to English. Simply because the languages have a few words in common, but not many, and they are altered. So congratulations to the person who has translated the work. Again, a couple things about the play. We're going to talk about the neoclassic ideal, which lays a whole big framework on the way that playwrights can write plays. There are a bunch of rules that playwrights are forced to follow because the neoclassics say that Aristotle said that this is the way the plays had to be written. Aristotle said a couple of the things they based their information on, but most of the rules they came up with were made up whole cloth. And again, I'm going to say a lot of the rules were made up in order to make Shakespeare look bad in his ilk. There is the onus of having to follow the rules of the neoclassics, and we'll get into that a little bit here. The play is pretty straightforward. You have a man, Tartuffe, who has invaded this family. The owner, the father of the family, certainly welcomes him in, and his mother certainly admires him, but the rest of the family can see that he is a hypocrite, that he is saying one thing to the father and to the mother, but he is totally two-faced in the sense that he is trying to come on to the wife. He is trying to interfere with the children's relationship. He's stealing money, eventually steals the entire estate from the father. Again, there's one of the things about the play is it makes fun of the clergy. And so when Moliere first wrote it, the clergy actually came and said and tried to censor the play. As a matter of fact, Moliere eventually had to write the play 3 times in order to satisfy the people who were in charge. Eventually, the way the play ends now, where the king suddenly comes out and proclaims the ending and knows the truth and all that sort of stuff, I'm going to say Moliere was sort of put that on as a tag in order to encourage the king, Louis XIV, by the time that he had written the play, to give his credence to the play, despite the fact that it criticized the clergy. But it certainly does put the king in a good light, being the omniscient thing that a king is. I do have a quick analysis of the script for those of you who haven't quite made it through or are having difficulty understanding what's going on. We'll watch a little video that explains the basic plot details.
One of Moliere's best loved and most scandalous plays is the 1664 comedy Tartuffe, or L'Imposture. Hold up that mirror, thought bubble. We meet Argone, a bourgeois dad who has recently fallen under the sway of Tartuffe, a holy man. And actually, Tartuffe isn't a holy man, he's a con man. And everyone in Argone's family realizes this but Argone and his mother. Argone believes Tartuffe and decides to give him his daughter Marianne, and Marianne is not psyched. Tartuffe also convinces Argone to disinherit and banish his son, Damis. Argone's family tries to get him to see through Tartuffe, but they're unsuccessful. Elmire, Argone's clever wife, convinces Argone to hide under the table while Tartuffe tries to seduce her. Finally, Argone realizes Tartuffe is a fraud, but Tartuffe gets hold of some incriminating letters and has Argone kicked out of his own house and accused of treason. It seems like it's all going to end badly, but somehow Louis XIV hears about Tartuffe's duplicity and arranges to have him arrested. Rex ex machina. Argone gets his stuff back, the family is reunited, and his daughter gets to marry someone she likes. Guess how much the Catholic Church liked Tartuffe? Not at all. A lot of religious leaders thought Moliere's attacks were about them specifically. The Archbishop of Paris wrote a letter saying he would excommunicate anyone who saw or even read the play. Pressured by the church and by family, the king supported a ban. Moliere had to revise the play, rewriting it so that it made less fun of the church, and he also changed the main character's name, but that version was banned too. He wrote a third version in 1669, and that's the one we have today. Thank you.
Again, if you have any questions about Tartuffe, feel free to write them to me, and we'll have a discussion online if we have questions about them. But again, I think the place, once you get past the rhythm and the meter, again, a lot of times you find yourself in the sing-song as you're reading it. So again, one of the reasons I've given you the entire play to watch is it sticks to the script very well, but it also makes it sometimes easier just to watch a play than it is to read the play. I certainly understand that. And you'll also get the sense of the interpretation that at least one company put onto Tartuffe. Yes? Well, let's get back to the Renaissance. The Renaissance, again, it spread slowly through from Italy to England over about 300 years. So the beginning of the Renaissance begins in the mid-15th century, really with the advent and the fall of Constantinople, which had been Byzantium. But the Muslims took control of Constantinople in 1453. Fortunately, I would say, but some of you might say unfortunately because we have all these rules we're going to talk about today. Much of the learning, education, history, all of Aristotle that we have, all the things from Aeschylus, from Sophocles, from Euripides, all those plays that we have existing today, all came to us on the boats that took the information from the library that had been in Byzantium / Constantinople and brought them to the west and they landed mostly in Italy. Now the nice thing about Italy during this time period, it is being, again we talk about the middle of the 15th century, Italy is not the strongest nation in the world, but it is very prosperous. There have been many times in Italy's history where there was a great deal of turmoil amongst the city-states in Italy, but unfortunately for everyone involved, at this point everything has calmed down, and there's this family that's a major family in Italy. They come from the Florence area, which is again where the casks of information mostly landed, or at least were mostly sent eventually. The Medicis were a very wealthy family. There were several popes among their number. They had a great influence in the church. One of the things about the Medicis is they had come up with a unique way of using the dregs at the bottom of a cask of wine. Whenever you make wine, for those of you who are winemakers, you know this, there's the good stuff that's throughout 90% of the barrel of wine, and then at the bottom of the barrel of wine there's this syrupy stuff that's too thick to drink. But one of the nice things about it is it also happens to be a little bit higher, well, a lot higher in alcohol content because it's all condensed there. Medici is the root word for medicine, because one of the things the Medicis did was they scooped this syrup out, they put it in bottles, and they sold it as an elixir. At probably twice the cost, if not 3 times the cost, depending on how many people were sick during the time period. Now, did it have any medicinal value? Much like today, if you were sick and had a cold, you might go get NyQuil. NyQuil is 14.5% alcohol. Now, a beer is 5.5% alcohol. So NyQuil is 3 times more potent than a beer. And I'm talking about NyQuil is a cup this thick. I mean, that's it. That's a shot of NyQuil. A beer is 12 ounces. So again, you're getting 3 times the alcohol content in this little shot of NyQuil. If you take 2 shots of NyQuil, you've done 5 shots of tequila, yes? And so I'm sure there are some things, antihistamines, other things that are in NyQuil, But for the most part, what those medicines do, and what the Medici's medicine did, was it knocked you out so that your body could naturally cleanse itself. Yes, a lot of times all it takes is the natural occurring system for your liver to cleanse the body, for your kidneys to do their work, to get rid of all the excess, and for your body to create antibodies. Yes, again, they sold this elixir as a cure-all, and so they were very smart business people and very wealthy. They had a man, Sebastiano Serlio. Serlio lived from 1475 to 1554. So again, this information had been piling up a little while before he actually got his hands on it. But he was one of the first people who went through these casks and started translating these books that he received and the scrolls that they had from Greek into Italian. Yes, again, the original scrolls from Aeschylus, from Aristotle, from Sophocles are all written in Greek, which is, for the most part, people in that period didn't understand how to read it. Again, it wasn't really until they found the Rosetta Stone, what Napoleon found in the 18th century, the late 17th century, that you had a way to translate hieroglyphics, but also, even though there were some clues as to how to translate Greek, it is the Rosetta Stone was the one that actually gave us a firm foundation that we actually did know what we were doing when we were translating Greek. So Serlio goes through, he finds this book by a Roman architect named Vitruvius. It's called De Architectura, and it was written sometime 1520 BC. There's absolutely no evidence that Vitruvius was actually an architect. What Vitruvius did, he wrote a series of 10 books, and again, that's what I mean by that is a scroll. And in each scroll, he went through and several of them were just drawings of the buildings. He would just draw the buildings, and he would say, this is what the building looks like. He would go through, and in one of the books, he described the structures and how they worked. For instance, one of the things that had been lost to history was how to build an arch. The idea of a keystone, a strong stone at the top of the arch to take the weight of the arch that had been in, had been lost to history. Serlio rediscovers, and others rediscover the idea of a keystone. And so one of the things that they build in Florence during this time period is a huge dome, which again is just a series of arches, and you fill in the gaps in between. And so Florence became the leading edge of what we're going to call the Renaissance. Now, Renaissance literally means rebirth. It is the introduction of humanism. Until the Renaissance, man was put on this earth to suffer. That's the Gothic ideal. That's the Christian ideal. We're here to serve our penance on earth, and we receive our golden jewelry after we get to live in heaven on the golden streets of heaven for the rest of our eternity. But we suffer here on earth. One of the things about the Renaissance is that the Renaissance thinkers said, you know what? We can have a good time while we're here on earth. Life isn't all that bad. We can have fun, we can sing, we can dance, we can enjoy life. We have to create these things. We have to create songs to dance to. We have to create plays to watch. But we are smart enough as human beings to be able to do this. And so one of the things about the Renaissance is it encourages innovation and learning. There's a rebirth in the interest of the arts, of medicine, the physics, of architecture. During the course of his analysis of De Architectura, Serlio comes to find out that theaters were built by the Romans and the Greeks, and that there were three types of plays. He learns that there are plays that are considered tragedies, there are plays that are considered comedies, and there are plays that he calls pastoral plays. Yes? Now, again, the book by Aristotle on tragedy is this thick. The book on comedy is this thick. He died before he wrote the book on melodramas. And so one of the nice things about the pastoral plays, Serlio knew there was this third type of play, and he pretty much can invent the rules. Again, he calls them pastoral plays as opposed to melodramas. He designs a set for each type of theater. He designs a set for tragedy, which takes place in the city. He designs a set for comedy, which takes place in a country town. He designs a set for pastoral play, which happens outdoors. Yes? One of the things that he invents is this idea of single point perspective. Again, he's an architect, so one of the mistakes he makes, if you look at the drawing there at the bottom, at the very top of that drawing, that's the grid that's on top there, that's a roof, which means they're not outside, they're indoors, they're in a room. So one of the things that happens that the Chariot makes the mistake of interpreting the Greek and the Roman plays is he doesn't know they take place outside. He's an architect, he builds rooms, he puts it in a room, it's a big room, but it's got a roof on it nonetheless. So you need to have unnatural lighting. In other words, the sun no longer is providing the light. You have to have things like candles, eventually gas, eventually electricity in the 19th century, that are going to provide alternative lighting sources for the actors on stage. Yes, I'm going to say you got pretty close. If you haven't really read or don't know anything about Greek and Roman theater, you've got an orchestra, a place down there where the dancing place happens. You've got a group of musicians back there that are playing. If you look at the background behind the proscenium arch, we'll talk about that, what that is later. But behind the picture frame back there, you can see that there are a bunch of, it looks like a pastoral play that's on stage. You got trees to the left there, clouds to the right, looks like to me. So they're performing some sort of pastoral play, and the single point perspective works best for the person who's sitting right in the middle of the audience. And so I'm going to say the person who's in the middle of the audience there is the Duke in charge, is the Count in charge, is the King in charge. That's the person that you're performing the play for. The other audience's members are there to be seen more than they are to see. Yes. One of the things about it, if you let's say you're a hat maker and you have a new type of hat that you want the king to see because you want him to buy that type of hat. Well, you dress up your young ladies and have them sitting in the audience wearing that hat, and hopefully the queen says, "Oh, I really like the look of that hat." And so one of the things about this becomes a way for tradesmen to improve their trade. Theater becomes a place to go, not just to see a play, but to be seen. Yes? And so again, the plays aren't really the thing. We don't really have copies of these plays. There are people who are beginning to write plays, but mostly they're pageants is what I'm going to call them. Their dances, their demonstrations, the scenery that they create it becomes quite elaborate. You have another group, as you get into the 16th century, another group of Italians invent this idea of multi-point perspective, where you have where you have a perspective go back instead of just going to the center. You have a perspective go off to the right and to the left there. Again, I've given you a couple of examples there. One's a palace. I think it's easier to see in the rampart, on the outside of the castle, where you have one wall of the castle going to a perspective stage left and one point of the castle going to a perspective stage right. But again, the thing about that type of thing, these are all painted drops, like you would have, again, they would take sailors off of ships and have the sailors rig these things in order to move, in order to fly, because the sailors knew how to do that on a ship. And all you did was take the sail and then painted the backdrop on it and then flew it up. Now, there's a tradition in theater that you shouldn't whistle because whistling was bad luck, and it comes from this time period because sailors communicated through whistling. And so if you didn't know what you were doing and you walked into the theater and you whistled something, there might be a drunken sailor up in the aft somewhere who might drop a sandbag on you or fly in a drop if you whistled the wrong tune. So that's where this comes from. Eventually they developed this system called system of chariots and poles. It is a very elaborate system for bringing scenery on and off stage. I've got a little video here. It is really amazing to see it work. I'll let you watch the video and we'll talk more about it on the opposite side. And you can see that it takes a lot of manpower to do this. It takes a lot of rigging. It takes a lot of pulleys, a lot of rope that if it breaks, it doesn't work. But for people during this time period, again, the lighting wasn't elaborate. You had mostly just candlelight. The shifting, the magic of this type of chariot and pole system shifting was truly theatrical magic. People were in disbelief that they were able to see such things happening. There were a group of academics who got together, who started translating gave you their version of what our good friend Aristotle said that plays, the rules you should follow when writing plays. Yes, their plays are based, or these rules are based upon the idea of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude means the appearance of truth. And Aristotle certainly said that a play works best when it has the appearance of truth, verisimilitude. But there's a big difference between can and must. When my daughter was 15, 16 years old, wanted to go out, and then I said, what time should I be back? I said, you should be home around 10. If she was home at 10:15, that's close enough. Should means one thing. Must be home by midnight. You're home at 12:05, you're in trouble. Why? Because, well, A, I gotta get to bed. But B, you scared the death out of me, yes? So the rules in the neoclassic system become, you have to follow these rules. Aristotle was just pointing out the way plays had been written 150 years before he was writing the rules. But now the neoclassics are coming in and creating this neoclassic ideal based on the ideal of verisimilitude and say you have to follow these rules. Now, again, we talked a lot about Aristotle a couple weeks ago. None of what I'm about to say did I ever mention when I mentioned Aristotle. In other words, they're making this stuff out of their hat. They're pulling it out of their hat. According to the neoclassic scholars, in order to maintain the idea of verisimilitude, you had to follow the three unities, is what they called them. They said there were unities of time, of place, and of action. Now, let's see if I can discuss what each one of those is separately. The unity of time means we walked into the theater today. You started watching this video today. You hope, you look here, clicking down on the timeline, seeing how long the video is, how much longer do I have to watch this thing. The neoclassic ideal stated that the play had to take place in a day. Because you walked into the theater today, in order to be believable, it had to be in a day. And if you look at Tartuffe, one of the things that's kind of incredible about it is that if you look at it, it all happens in the course of a day. He does follow the rule, yes? The unity of place. We've walked into a theater, yes? We haven't been walking around, we haven't gone from one place to another. We've walked into a room and we're watching a play. The unity of place means you happen in one environment. And the unity of action means that there's all these subplots that Shakespeare had created about alternative stories that are being told that are resonant to the main story. All those go out the window. Again, if you were trying to create a system that said that Shakespeare was awful, it would be hard to find a better system because Shakespeare followed none of these rules. As a matter of fact, he broke all these rules. Almost all of his plays take place over many days. Hamlet starts, it starts with about 2 months after the death of his father. At one point, he gets to be sent off to England. That doesn't happen in a day. Yes, his lover, Ophelia, goes through this whole madness thing where she commits suicide. All that takes time. Again, he's got the story of Fortinbras. Again, it's not in some of the versions of Hamlet, but that's a subplot, a totally separate story that's happening in resonance with the main story. All those particulars mean that Shakespeare doesn't follow the rules of the neoclassics, and so for about 150 years, Shakespeare falls out of vogue. Yes, people stop doing Shakespeare because he doesn't follow these neoclassic rules. Yes, the play had, according to the neoclassics, a play had two functions: to teach and to please. One of the things about, again, the Renaissance began in Italy in the latter half of the 15th century. We talked about the last class period, the Commonwealth in England begins around 1638, and you have the court of England start fleeing east to France around that time period. And France really has taken over from Spain in the 17th century as the most powerful nation in Western Europe. And one of the reasons for that is because by this time, Islam had invaded the southern tip of Spain and had taken control of the Strait of Gibraltar. So no longer could you send ships into and out of the Mediterranean for trade. And so any trade that happened between England and Italy or Greece or any of those countries, east and west, had to travel through France. And so France just levied taxes, tariffs on goods that were traveling through France. And Louis XII, at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, is the person who brings France to the forefront in world politics. Yes, it's about the time that the Louisiana Purchase happens. So again, or at least the property in Louisiana is being gotten up. You have the French-Indian War happening in America. So France is exerting its dominance throughout the world at the beginning of the 17th century. Yes. And so there's this man, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu lives from 1585 to 1642. And when Louis XII dies, Louis XIII is only 6 years old. And so even though Louis XIII technically is king, Cardinal Richelieu acts as his regent. Now, Cardinal Richelieu is a very interesting character in history. I'm going to say, again, the Cardinal is the Pope's representative in France. He lives in the Notre Dame Cathedral. One of the things about Richelieu is he's very educated, very smart. He has bought the monopoly for theater in France from Louis XII. Now, a monopoly can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. Monopoly is a single ownership of a particular industry. So for instance, Ma Bell, yes, AT&T, for over 100 years had a monopoly in the telephone industry. And one of the things about the telephones, I don't know if you've ever come across a telephone from the 70s, 60s, 50s. They were made out of this plastic called Bakelite. It was a light plastic, but it was strong. There have been many a widow who killed her husband by just smashing his head in with a telephone, because if the telephone fell off the table and hit your foot would break, but the phone would be fine. And the reason for that is because Ma Bell, you never bought the phone from Ma Bell from AT&T, you rented the phone from AT&T. AT&T owned everything. And the customers just rented the lines, rented the phones. And again, over 100 years, AT&T strung all of America with telephone lines. Now again, today we're having microwaves, and so we have other ways of having the communication happen. But for the first 100 years, AT&T spent all this money connecting America, and it wasn't until the mid-70s that suddenly you had MCI and other telephone companies come around and say, hey, we should be able to use this because it is now a public forum. The public paid for a lot of this. Just local governments would pay a lot of times, would match the fees that AT&T was charging or paying for the putting up of lines and that sort of stuff, especially in rural areas. And so MCI sued and broke up Ma Bell, and then you had Southwestern Bell, Central Bell, there were 12 baby bells, I think is the number 12. Anyway, same sort of thing that happened to computers. When Microsoft came out with all these operating systems, suddenly you had various computer systems come in and say, listen, we need to have a way to in order to have our programming work, we have to break up Microsoft. And so again, sometimes, especially early in an industry, monopoly can be good. It can also be bad because it resists change. There's no way that we would be to a way where we have this as the phone if AT&T still had a monopoly on theater. We would still have Bakelite phones that would crash over each other's heads. Funny story. I digress. But I saw an ad from the mid '80s, I guess, for like it was a hardware store, and all the little things that are on here were all $100. They had a telephone for $100. They had a camera for $100. There was an ad machine was $100. All the little things that this thing just does were all on sale for $100. They were all separate devices. Answering machines were $100 for an answering machine. They're all little blocks that did those little things, but now your phone does them all. and we have much more. So anyway, so Richelieu started off, I'm going to say, as a businessman, very smart. He established this thing called the French Academy, which he used to censor people's statements about the king. He would also use it to enforce the neoclassic ideal. If playwrights wrote plays that he felt didn't follow the rules of the neoclassic, he would have it shut down. A, because he had the monopoly, and B, because he controlled this thing called the French Academy. And so he becomes a very powerful man over time. If you've ever read The Three Musketeers, the book The Three Musketeers, Cardinal Richelieu is the bad guy. And again, I'm not saying initially he was, but over time he becomes enamored of the power that he holds. I'm going to use this as an example. It may or may not be true. The story of the Man in the Iron Mask. The story goes that when Louis XIII came of age, there suddenly appeared a prisoner in the French prisons who had an iron mask around their head, and no one was able to take it off. And the reason for that is that Richelieu had actually imprisoned the real Louis XIII and found somebody who looked a lot like Louis XIII and put that person on the throne. The point of the story is that Louis XIII pretty much did whatever Cardinal Richelieu told him to do. So Cardinal Richelieu had a great deal of influence over Louis XIII. Again, not to get too much into French history, but pretty much, and this is not true, but the French kings are either called Charles or Louis, and for the most part, if it's an even Charles or an even Louis, they were very strong, very powerful kings. If they were even-numbered Louis, they were very weak, well, they were not good kings. Now, Louis XV is a notable exception. There are exceptions, that's for sure. But for the most part, that's true. Now, and there's a couple of Henrys in there, but they're really English. So, Louis XIII is now King of England. There's a little painting that I have here for you. Now, first of all, this painting is about 20 feet tall and about 60 feet wide. It's enormous. It's in the Louvre. So it's these figures are life-size. And as you look at the painting, the man with the feather in his cap looking back towards you is Louis XIII. The Queen of France is to his left. And the guy who is not even paying any attention to you, now this is not a photograph, mind you. This is a painting that people sat for. And Cardinal Richelieu could care so little about who you are as the audience to this painting. He is watching a play, very much. If you look into the distance, this theater is called the Cardinal Theater. He built this theater at what was his home, and he had these performances for the court and his theater. And you can see it's a pastoral play in the distance. There's action on stage. There's trees going around, so that's a pastoral play. And he is so busy watching this play, he can't even take time out of his day to look at you. That's how powerful he is. If you don't know who he is, then you aren't important enough to know who he is. Yes. So anyway, he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, I'll say. One of the things about, he brings Torelli in. Torelli is an Italian designer who is one of the major innovators with the Chariot pole system. And so Torelli comes over and brings all this multi-point perspective to French theater. And the people in the Commonwealth come to France and learned about these new neoclassic ideals and how to write plays in that vein. Yes? Probably the best playwright during this time period. As a matter of fact, I would say he's the first playwright to both incorporate the neoclassic ideals and write plays that were very popular. One of his plays, Le Cid, which is about a Spanish king, conqueror, was an incredibly popular play. Again, one of the problems is because it has to happen in one day, he has an entire Spanish war happen in a day, which even in modern days, with the wars today, we don't really have them in a day. We may have them in 3 or 4 days, but not really a day. But so it stretches the believability. But Corneille lived from 1606 to 1684, and he wrote 32 plays. All of his plays are tragedies, and he was the favorite of good friend Cardinal Richelieu. As a matter of fact, I would say he is the first person in France to give the playwright a name. He's the first playwright outside of during the Renaissance. Yes. Along comes our good friend Louis XIV, the Sun King. The Sun King is the exact opposite of Louis XIII. The Sun King, he eventually builds Versailles. France again becomes the most powerful nation. Louis XII started the change, the transition, but under Louis XIV, France is the dominant power in the West, and he hires a man named Moliere. Now, Moliere was born Jean-Baptiste Pourquoi. I just like saying it, Jean-Baptiste Pourquoi. And Jean-Baptiste Pourquoi's father was the furniture maker to the kings. And so what he would do was make these pieces of furniture. They were, if you've ever had French furniture, it's very delicate, very thin. Usually the legs are curved. Usually it's painted white, and it'll have little edges of blue and or edges of gold. It looks like porcelain, really. So he would make these furniture pieces. He would give them to the monarchy. He would give it to the king. And then the way he made his money is that people in the court who wanted to have furniture like the king's would then buy the furniture from him. Yes. So one of the things about Jean-Baptiste Pourquoi is that early in his life, he was born in 1622, died in 1673. Early on in his life, he was given the job of taking care of the rugs of the French king. That was his job. He made sure they were clean, he made sure they were changed out, he made sure they weren't threadbare. If there were any damage to them, he took care of them. When he was 21 years old, he went to see a play, and the leading lady was a woman named Madeleine Moliere. Now, there are a lot of people during his lifetime that really didn't like Moliere. And one of the rumors that they spread was that Moliere was his first cousin. I don't believe that's true. It's not necessarily obvious what Moliere's lineage is, but she certainly, the family didn't claim her, let's put it that way. But if you want to experience what Moliere experienced, you can do this today. Go home and see or write your parents or call your parents and say, hey, I've been taking this theater appreciation class, and it has changed my perspective on life. I've decided to become a theater major. That's what Moliere did. He went home and said, Mom, Dad, I appreciate the fact that you're not a member of the court, but everyone in the court knows who you are. You are high in society. I appreciate that, but I've decided to join this theater company and run away with them. They turned their backs on him, and that's when he took up the moniker or the name Moliere, which is the way he wrote and continued to write the rest of his life. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the Commedia dell'arte, the type of group that he joins. In England, when the transition came, the theater went from the pageant wagon shows to the mummers plays. In Italy and in France, the pageant wagons are still going on. The Pope is still reigning, yes? And so the pageant wagons are still going on. So out of this new idea of a professional theater, in Italy and in France, there develops this type of theater called the Commedia dell'arte. I'm gonna let you watch a little video on Commedia, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more after.
It's the Commedia dell'arte, which means artful comedy or the comedy of players. It's the earthier, lustier counterpart to the Commedia erudita, and it has an even more dramatic special effect: women. That's right, from 1560 on, women were finally allowed on stage in Italy. They won't show up on stage in England for another century. More on that later. Scholars can't really agree on the origins of the Commedia dell'arte, but the most popular theory traces its lineage from our old lewd friend, the Atellane farces. These had been preserved by strolling minstrels and jesters during the Middle Ages. Like the Atellane farces, Commedia dell'arte relies on stock characters and improvised situations that allowed the actors to string together conveniently memorized lines in an array of prearranged comedic bits called lazzi. Basically, a lazzo is a gag. There are books listing hundreds of lazzi, like hat lazzi and food lazzi and P Lazzi, and just countless Lazzi involving butts. The mix of Lazzi and improvisation meant that while most stories progressed along the usual Plautus, Terence, Menander-like lines, an audience never knew exactly which Lazzi a stock character would throw into the mix, or how other stock characters would react. No! That was a Lazzo of fear. It was hilarious. Stock characters were based on regional types, so each had a specific style of dress, a specific accent, and even a specific food associated with them. Each traveling troupe of 8 to 12 actors had a slightly different mix of types, but here are some of the main ones: masters, servants, and lovers. Let's see some more in the thought bubble. There are usually 3 masters. The captain, or capitano, he's a Spanish military guy with a mask and a cape and a sword and a mustache. He's swaggering and braggy until he actually gets near a fight, and then he's a coward. Pantalone is a miserly merchant type from Venice who wears a red vest and a long coat, plus a mask with a big nose and a gray beard. Even though he's old, he lusts after young women, and the young women are not psyched about it. The doctor, or il dottore, is, surprise, a doctor from Bologna, masked and dressed like an academic. The doctor is a friend of Pantalone's, and he needs everyone to know how smart he is, so he uses a lot of Latin words and phrases. Some of the grosser urine Lazzi involve him, and his wife is often cheating on him. Between the Latin and the urine, I mean, can you blame her? And now, the servants, who are often called zani. They're mostly men, though some troops had women who played maids. Harlequin, or Arlecchino, wears a green mask and a diamond suit. He carries a wooden sword that he hits people with. He's wily and acrobatic, but also kind of simple, and boy, is he hungry. He speaks in gibberish. Pulcinello was a less defined type, but he's from Naples and dressed in a hunchback and a pointy hat. There was another servant, Brigella, who was mean and kind of a lech, though he's really more of an 18th century figure. Finally, the lovers. They are nice and fresh-faced and clean-cut. Sometimes they're a little stupid. They don't wear masks. They're kind of boring. Still, it's their love, often thwarted, that gets the plot going. Thank you, Thought Bubble. We still have books of Lazzi, and even some Commedia dell'arte scripts, though they're not that great. Later dramatists, like 18th century writer Carlo Goldoni, wrote plays based on Commedia dell'arte, so you can check out a work like The Servant of Two Masters if you're curious. What we do know is these plays follow conventional narrative lines, but what happens in the middle is fast and gross and apparently really, really funny, because the genre lasts for centuries, into today. Ever heard of slapstick? Yeah, that was a term for Arlecchino's wooden sword. A slap stick. Eh? Right? Slap. Oh, come on. You're no fun. So the next time you see some rude physical comedy, amaze and delight your friends by telling them that the wedgie they just saw derives from an Italian Renaissance form, and then hope that your friends still talk to you. Don't avoid eye contact with me. Where are you going? Next time.
So you can see that there was a group of stock characters. Basically, the story is Romeo and Juliet. You have the 2 young lovers, yes, who are, for whatever reason, the parents can't agree to get them along together. So there's this conflict between the 2. There's some sort of a Lazzi, again, as a stock character. You have these clowns that have certain attributes. There's some of them are smart but are fat. Some of them are lazy but have money. So different characters have different colors. They have different ideas about the world. They have different shapes, different sizes. Again, you're seeing these people, and a lot of times language. A lot of this is slapstick comedy, where people are hitting each over the head with swords that are wooden. It is very much clown type of behavior. But these types of plays start being done. French Commedia really develops. The major difference, I would say, they both have very striking costumes, and again, they're very clownish looking. But French Commedia really is more black and white. There'll be a little flourish of color, maybe a teardrop. There'll be a jeweled color on their eye or a ribbon in their hair. But for the most part, they're black and white figures, whereas Italian Commedia is very colorful. Again, a lot of geometric shapes, very big, very bold colors in the Italian Commedia. The acting is not subtle, but this is the type of troupe that Moliere joins. And for the next 18 years, he tours the countryside writing plays for this type of theater. Now, one of the things about Moliere, we have 33 of his plays existent today, but there's evidence that he wrote over 100 more. I'm going to say mostly because these Commedia troops were illiterate. They probably couldn't read and write, so he would basically come up with a scenario, and then they would fill in the gaps or learn the lines, but he didn't really sort of write down the lines. No one actually kept the scripts. He may have actually written the scripts, it's just that no one kept them around because nobody could read them. Yes, it wasn't until later in his life, in 1660, he performs for Louis XIV, and Louis XIV takes the theater that Cardinal Richelieu had built under Louis XIII, and he takes it into the monarchy and it becomes called the Theatre Royal. And Louis XIV takes Moliere and establishes Moliere as the playwright in residence for the Theatre Royal. And for the last decade of his life, he is writing plays at this King's Theatre, which again is very much the French version of Shakespeare in England. Yes, of his probably his best known plays are Tartuffe, which you've read, The Misanthrope, School for Wives, Learned Ladies. He wrote a play called The Imaginary Invalid. And this is the last play. Again, he acted in his own plays, but at the end of the play, Imaginary Invalid, basically the play is about this man who is a hypochondriac. He, whatever the disease of the day is, COVID-19, he definitely had it. Tennis elbow, he definitely had it. Whatever the disease of the bird flu, he definitely had it. Whatever the symptoms were, he would feel it, and suddenly he would be sick with it just like everybody else. Of course, he never was, and so people stopped believing that he was sick, and at the end of the play, Imaginary Invalid, he comes down with this disease, and he's telling everybody that he's about to die, and nobody believes him because he's been lying all this time, and of course, at the end of the play, he passes away. Moliere was performing this play, and at curtain call, when he dies, the character dies, he was playing the lead character, the curtain went up for the curtain calls, and Moliere did not get up. Now, he did not actually physically die until later that evening, but he passed out on the stage, and of course everyone thought he was dead. Eventually passed away that evening, but he actually passed away performing The Imaginary Invalid. And because he was not able to receive last rites, and because actors are not viewed as, they made fun of the clergy, so they were not considered to be the fine people. They were not in the upper class. He was buried in a pauper's grave, and it really wasn't for another 50, 100 years that people actually respected Moliere enough to actually dig him up and create a throne, memorial to our good friend Moliere in France. Cool? All right, so that's the way that the Renaissance began to spread from Italy to France, and then when the restoration of the throne happens in 1658, Oliver Cromwell passes away. 1660, Charles II, who was the brother of Charles I, who had been beheaded in Parliament. Charles II is restored to the throne, and so you have this period in time that again, in Italy and in France, the neoclassic rules are going to hold for another 150 years, till 1830 really. But in England, we have this amalgamation of the Elizabethan playwrights, the way they wrote, the stories they told, with the rules of the neoclassics, and so it alters a little bit and becomes this thing called Restoration Theater. We'll talk more about that next time.